Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, Executive Director of Denison Forum. Thank you for being a part of today's conversation. We have a special guest with us that I'm excited to introduce to you. You may have come across some of his work, but today we're talking with Curtis Chang, who is the founder and leader of an interesting organization called RedeemingBabel.org. Curtis, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's so great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let me give our audience a little bit of background about Curtis. Curtis, as a theologian, is on the consulting faculty of Duke Divinity School, and he is also a senior fellow at the Fuller Theological Seminary. His ministry experience includes serving as a senior pastor of Evangelical Covenant Church in California. He has also been a campus minister with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and has done mission work in Soweto, South Africa. He has authored or contributed to a number of books, including Engaging Unbelief, a captivating strategy from Augustine to Aquinas. Curtis is fueled by a passion to help Christians recognize the surprising authority and relevance of Jesus for parts of life that are often left to the secular world. We'll get into some of that in a minute. His biblical insights are enriched by his own secular career, which includes founding an award-winning nonprofit consulting firm and serving on the faculty of the School of International Service at American University. Curtis graduated from Harvard University and is a former Rockefeller Fellow. He is married with 2 children, most importantly, and lives in San Jose, California. He enjoys, I like this, hiking, fantasy baseball, and is severely addicted to dark chocolate, which I've never acquired a taste for, Curtis.
Oh my goodness, we need to send you some good stuff there, Mark, to get you hooked.
Well, I keep hearing from you dark chocolate guys that it's so much better than milk chocolate, but I haven't made that transition yet.
Once you do, you'll never come back. You'll come to the dark side, Mark.
All
To
right.
the dark side.
All right. Well, tell us a little bit. Number one, I'm just curious as to how you would choose the name for an organization, RedeemingBabel.org. What's the story behind the name, and where did that ministry or that part of your ministry come about?
Well, that came really about, the name comes from the biblical story of Babel, the Tower of Babel. And there's not often a lot of teaching or preaching about why that story is there and what its meaning is. And one of the things that I'm trying to help people understand is that story is the story of the fall told institutionally, told organizationally. So it's,
Wow.
The Adam and Eve story is the story of the fall told in the lens of an individual and a couple, the prototypical family. Where Genesis 11 comes in with the Tower of Babel, it's really trying to state now the problem of sin and fallenness has taken on not just individual forms, but it's taken on institutional forms. So the Babel is the story of the fall. And but what that means, because it seems that God is wanting to convey that human organizations and their fallen nature is part of the biblical story. It also opens up hope, because right after Genesis 11 is Genesis 12, which is a story of the calling of Abram. And the calling of Abram is to found the nation, the people of Israel, which is to say, because the fall has institutional form with the Babel's trying to convey, God's story of redemption also has to have organizational, collective, institutional form. And that's really why the Babel story goes right into Abram and the founding, the ultimate origin story of Israel. It shows that human institutions also participate in God's big story of redemption of humanity. And that's why we call our initiative, our organization, Redeeming Babel, because a key part of our work is trying to help Christians see that organizational life matters to God, that our calling as Christians includes participating in God's plan for redeeming organizations as well as individuals. But that we're trying to introduce that perspective, because organizations are human. They're human organizations. And so if we believe that God has redeemed humanity ultimately in Jesus, then we need to kind of push out and expand our imagination of what redemption looks like to not just solely be individual. It certainly includes the individual, but also include the organizational.
Well, that's really helpful from the standpoint that, as I was looking on your website, we spend so much of our life in organizations, be it in a company or a school, the PTA, and on a very small scale. The way you just in your describing that to me, Curtis, it just thinks about. I know when I was pastoring churches, I would see this reality in some way, particularly like in the lay leadership. We would have a body of deacons that might have 10 or 20 men in it. And I would, if I was to walk up to an average church member in my church and say, well, what do you think about this person in our church or this deacon or this leader? And they would just rave about how they love that person. But if I asked them, well, what do you think about the deacons as a group? They
Mm.
usually had very negative things to say. And I was like, well, it's made up of the same people that if we talk about them individually, you speak in glowing terms,
Yeah.
but now when they're a group, you feel like they're doing something terrible behind closed doors that you don't seem to like much of anything that they do in that context. And so
That's so
that,
interesting. And I think what you're describing names precisely what happens when we don't think of an organizational body as participating in the human, that we are more prone then to demonize it or to distrust it. We treat institutions, therefore, when we don't think of them as participating in the human, we treat them in a way that we instinctively, intuitively, as Christians, no, we're not supposed to treat another human individual, right? And your story precisely names that gap, that we are with an individual. We will want to extend grace. We will want to forgive. We will want to understand, okay, that person is fallen and sinful, but there's hope for that individual. But when it comes to institution, all that goes out the window. That we don't extend grace. We are incredibly suspicious and distrustful. We lose all hope for our institutions, and that's just a blatant contradiction of the biblical vision of what it means to be human and to have human hope centered in Jesus.
mm. And we hear a lot of talk about this in multiple media outlets these days. When you're speaking organizationally or institutionally, that includes when we use the term, well, there is this thing called systemic racism that
Hmm.
that would be an example of organizational or collective uh, brokenness
Sure.
in the story. But we hear that term a lot more. But we seem to be living in. Tell me if you have some data points on this. But we seem to be living in this age where there is widespread distrust, seemingly of all institutions. But before we kind of get to that, just want to go back and just for our audience, it just sometimes helps me to remember what the definitions are that we're talking about. So a simple Webster's definition of institution is there are a couple of them. One of them, an established organization or corporation, especially of public character. And the dictionary uses a university as an example of that. A second definition that might be helpful for us, that an institution is a significant practice, relationship, or organization in a society or culture. An example being the institution of marriage.
Right.
Would you agree with that? Would you add more to that, Curtis?
It is a term that is sort of used loosely, that can on one hand be a specific organization, but also I think a set of practices that are collectively embodied, like you just said. I tend to use that term more when I mean by institution, by organizations, like a specific concrete organization. But I think a lot of what we're talking about could also be applied to collective practices that have an ongoing life beyond just the individual practice.
Right. So is it how do we know that our relationship or trust within the fundamental institutions of our culture, how do we know whether that's tracking upward or downward? Is it just simply a matter of repetitive surveys? And
Yeah,
then
all the surveys show that distrust is increasing in very toxic form, and accelerating. So I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but basically, certainly distrust in the government, federal government, is at an all-time high. distrust. And then when we had, the George Floyd incident, then there was a sharp increase in distrust in police institutions, especially among certain, segments of our population. And now it seems like, even in higher ed, took a big hit with the pandemic, and them sort of failing to deliver a quality educational experience during COVID. So basically, you go up and down the line. There is almost no institution, including Christian institutions, with the number of scandals that have hit the Christian world, from Kanakuk camps to Arzim to Liberty University. You can just kind of go down the line. That institutional distrust is an all-time high, and this is actually part of the urgency of trying to help Christians think more spiritually, more biblically about institutions, because again, we should not be surprised that all these institutions are struggling or failing, because we actually have in the Bible a narrative, and the Babel narrative is actually a prime example of that. It's like, oh wait, we should expect some fallenness and brokenness. They're human. They are human organizations, and just like we would never expect a human individual to not sin, not to have fallenness, not have brokenness, we wouldn't expect that. We should not expect that of an institution, but instead, actually, realize, oh, therefore, that's why we need to participate in God's redemptive work for both individuals and institutions.
Which is really what we see in the biblical story, right? We see this kind of back and forth telling of the story of brokenness and redemption between individuals and uh, between groups or organizations like Israel in
Yeah.
writ large, right?
Hmm.
That this is the collective experience, and we see Israel as a group going back and forth between faithfulness and unfaithfulness, in the whole story. And then you see elements of it in the church as well in the New Testament context. Uh, I'm wondering, as we kind of set the frame here, I've come across organizations over a number of years that try to describe our society or our culture by either a number of institutions or at least a number of categories of institutions. Do you think that's helpful I know one organization has 7 what they call pillars or mountain peaks of society. Is that a helpful way to think about it, at least in terms of government, religion, education, art, business? Are those kinds of categories helpful to kind of frame the big picture, or is that not the best way to do it?
I'm not sure how helpful that is. Perhaps at some level, I think the challenge is that, just like human individuals have an incredible amount of diversity, and it's hard to categorize each individual. Like, what are you? Like, well, I'm a lot of things. I'm a dad. I'm a son. I'm a brother. I'm a theologian. I'm a pickleball player. How do you? I actually think organizations similarly participate in that kind of diversity. That we have a lot of organizations that it's actually really difficult to say, oh, you're this, because they represent the diversity of humanity. Even if you think about a college or a university, yes, they are an educational institution, but they're also a research institution. They also produce public policy. They also, are social institution for the formation of our youth. And so there's just, I think institutions are very diverse, and therefore I'm not sure how helpful it is to just sort of say, "Oh, you're this in particular."
Right. So they have multiple functions oftentimes because, like I said, because of their length and breadth and depth of what they're involved in, right?
Exactly. And Mark, maybe if I could just say, because I think if you have listeners that are, hearing me talk about institutions as participating in God's story of redemption, if that's if for some of your listeners, I suspect that's like, okay, that makes sense. That the human is not just the human individual, but that the human also is collective humans, whether it's families, churches, nations, and so forth. But I've just found that there's something about when I say organizations, and especially secular organizations, as participating in God's story of redemption, people get really hung up. And so so I've actually created a course that helps Christians do that. But if I could just do like a quick sound bite
Sure.
from this course to help. And I don't usually like to proof text sort of theological truths with one verse, but sometimes it's helpful to have a summary verse that helps people just at least think, wait a minute, that's in there? That's in the Bible?
Right.
So if people want to just, on your own, or you can follow along with me, turn to Colossians 1:15 to 18, or to 17, 15 to 17. It's just short 2 verses. But these are critical passages to the other church. This passage, Colossians 1, is really what biblical scholars call as the hymn of Christ, which is, it's a regular, biblical scholars believe that the early church regularly repeated these verses as part of their regular liturgy, or part of their regular service. The truths contained in these verses were meant to be really embedded in the early Christian mind. And let me just read, starting from Colossians 1:15. It says, he, which is referring to Jesus here, he is the image. And I want folks to key in on that concept. He is the image of the invisible God. So Jesus is the perfect image, perfect representation of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, which means that all of creation then kind of is a image of the image. It's Jesus is the perfect image, but as the firstborn, then all of us sort of second and third and fourth and so forth borns, then therefore participate in this imaging function. So that he's just, this passage is just repeating that basic notion that human beings are made in the image of God, right? So he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him, by Jesus, all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. So this is the idea that all of humanity ultimately is a reflection of Jesus. So if Jesus is the perfect image, we are kind of sort of secondary images. We're reflecting Jesus as Jesus reflects perfectly. And all things have the potential to reflect Jesus, to image Jesus. But then notice he says all things, all things. So you're like, okay, well, what is included in this all things? What can actually image God in this way? And this is where I want folks to just sit with this, because what the passage, with this liturgy, with this hymn of Christ, is really trying to emphasize, really trying to get the early Christians to remember, says this is what's included in all things now. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now notice the specific example given to illustrate what all things are that have this reflective image-bearing capacity. It is thrones, dominions, rulers, or authorities. That is biblical language for institutions. That's how the first century would describe the range of organizations. And notice it's visible and invisible. So the early Christian biblical imagination said a given organization has both visible expression, like the concrete, Roman army marching before me, but also invisible. That there's also an invisible dimension. There's a spiritual quality behind what is the visible organization. And that's really the biblical imagination, is that organizations have not just the physical concrete reality, but they also have a spiritual reality, an invisible spiritual reality behind them. And the ultimate created purpose for that spiritual function of organizations is to image God. That's what this whole passage is about, imaging the invisible God, to bear witness, to show something of who God is. That's the purpose of every organization. And notice it's all organizations, because the all things is really important. So it's not just Christian organizations. It's not just Christian things that image God. It includes all organizations, including secular, non-Christian organizations, also participate in this imaging function. And the reason why I emphasize this all things that encompasses and includes secular organizations, it's because as a former pastor, I know that the majority of my congregants spend most of their lives working spending hours, 40, 50 hours a week, working in secular organizations. And if you think then that part of your life working in these secular organizations doesn't participate in God's plans and purposes in the world, then that means a huge chunk of your life is now just ruled out of bounds of having real spiritual significance, right? It's real spiritual meaning. And so that's why I'm so passionate to help Christians understand organizations also have this imaging function, and therefore those 40, 50, 60 hours a week that you're spending serving and advancing the library, the hospital, the widget making factory, the insurance company, that those are invested with God's purposes as well.
Yeah, I ran into exactly what you're talking about when, when we're trying as a pastor to help people see everything through a sacred lens, that in a biblical way there is no such thing as this secular part of the world over here that's divorced from all things that are made by Christ. But recently I was at an event and I met a man who was now in his early 60s. He was transitioning, and he described this in exactly the way that you're talking about. Unfortunately, the kind of thing that you're trying to get people to see differently. He told me that he had had a very successful career, but now he was looking at going and working with a particular ministry that he described to me, and he was excited about actually flying out the next day to go have an interview. And he said, I think I've finally gotten to the point in my life where I've made enough money and I can sustain myself, and now I can go do something that's really going to make a difference.
Right.
And
Like,
it's like the past it's like the last 40 years was just filler,
yeah, yeah,
to earn the place where he could now go do something that would make a kingdom difference for Christ. And I was like, no, you don't understand
yeah.
everything you've been doing. But it was almost like, well, I've been living a second grade kind of life
Right,
until I could
right.
get up to the big leagues. And now I can really be involved directly in what God is doing. And I'm like, no, that's not really the best way to see that.
Yeah, and we who are pastors, we bear responsibility for helping people have that sense of God's purpose for their non explicitly Christian, ministry life. And this, honestly, this is what explains my own vocational path. So I was a pastor of an evangelical covenant church in California, and one of the reasons I left the pastorate, I'm still a member of that church, but I resigned as a senior pastor, was because I realized I was participating in this sort of divide between the sacred and secular. Because while my theology was that I believed that the 40, 50 hours that my congregants were working at Apple and Google and IBM, that they really was part of God's purposes and God's work in the world. I honestly actually couldn't really give a very coherent narrative for why it was true that it mattered. And I realized part of that was just because I'd not worked in any secular organization myself. So whenever I graduated, I went into ministry right away. So, and I thought, I can't really preach and explain to them how their work, at least effectively, without some better experience working in the secular world. And I also, what always I would get stuck in trying to preach on sort of faith and work was, you get to that part of the sermon where you want to give a call to action, right? Like any good
Mhm.
pastor is like, okay, now what are you going to do with these truths, right?
Right.
And whenever I got to that, constructed to that imaginary sermon in my mind, I'd get to that part about the call to action. I realized I didn't know what to call them to. Like all I had in terms of active call was like, so go volunteer at the soup kitchen that the church runs. Go volunteer to be a teacher at the Sunday school because we need more Sunday school teachers, or we need more youth group leaders. And it was always calling people to do stuff for the church, the institutional, wall within the institutional walls of the church. And while that's super important and necessary and absolutely should be considered, I realized I just never had and this is what you should be called to actually outside the walls of the church in the organizations that you are actually spending the majority of your life. And so this is why I resigned. I started a consulting firm made up of actually a lot of folks from my church, and it was a consulting firm to serve secular, again, non-Christian, secular nonprofits. And again, I'm using secular in air quotes there, right? Like I
Right.
agree with you. There's ultimately no secular versus sacred, but sociologically speaking, these were secular nonprofits or government agencies. And for the last 15 years, I've been running this firm, and it's just been eye-opening to start to see how God's purposes are connected to all of these organizations. And it's given me a really rich and a sort of understanding and a passion to help Christians realize that these organizations, even if they are not explicitly Christian, they are still part of that Colossians 1:15 to 17 collection of all things, of all of those thrones, dominions, rulers, or authorities.
Well, and really, really helpful for just any Christian to understand. It doesn't matter what environment that God has put you in by gifting and by passion. If you can start seeing your work as a school teacher or as a nurse, or if you're working in a factory building cars, or you're managing people who do those things, when you're in those environments, like I said, when you're working in technology, you're not living in a part that's separated from the kingdom of God. That's actually your kingdom assignment,
Yeah.
where where you can live out your best giftedness all the years of your life, right?
Totally. And just to kind of do one more turn on that, we have to remember that the one of the primary ways that we bear God's image is the image of God as creator. That if you look at and read Genesis 1 and 2, the human beings, what it meant for them to be called to steward creation, right? And it really is a stewarding function that humanity was made to do, explained in Genesis 1 and 2. It involves creation. It involves bringing new things into being. It's most immediately expressed by the call to Eve to name the animals. Like she's bringing and creating order. Like you're this, you belong here. You're this kind of animal. You're that kind of animal. And then there's other ways that as you read the Genesis narrative that human beings begin to create things, bring new things into the world, and that's a reflection, an imaging of God as creator. And now this is the key thing: is human beings are not meant to do most things alone,
Mm.
especially creation, right? The biblical narrative makes it very clear. It's not good for man to be alone. And even the creation of life can't be done alone. It requires male and female. And therefore, all the rest of kinds of ways in which human beings create are also not meant to be done alone. And we see this in our everyday life. It's very hard to create anything meaningful in this world by yourself. You're almost always going to be depending on somebody else, some other resources, some other people to cooperate and do this together with. That's just what an organization is. An organization is an expression of human beings coming together to create things, to create new things in the world. And so if one of your listeners are wondering like, wait, but I work in blank company, how does that participate in God's purposes? One question to ask is, well, what are you creating? What is, by you, I mean the organization. What is this organization creating? What is it bringing anew into the world? And in what ways is that new reality, that new thing being created, how does that image God? Right? You know, if it's a new piece of art that you're creating, how does that reflect, even unconsciously, not explicitly, but even unconsciously, reflect something about the artistry of God? If you're bringing some sort of new thing that organize that you're an accounting firm and you're bringing order into the finances, well, that's reflecting something about God's desire for order and resources to be well distributed, well appointed, apportioned, and so forth. So it takes some fresh thinking. We're not used to thinking about organizations in this way of thinking about what is it creating, what does it bring into the world, and in what way does that new reality reflect something about who God is, including who God is as a creator. It's a different. We haven't been trained to think this way, but the Colossians 1:15 to 17 worldview ought to train us to think this way, because again, all things were created in Him, for Him, and through Him.
Right, which is another indication of just how hyper individualized we've
Mm.
become, right?
Yeah,
That, um, but really the most beautiful things, in many ways, the most complex things, are created by people working together. I mean, even the very earliest story, right? If two, it takes two human beings to create a third human being,
that's
right?
right.
Is the
Yeah,
way God set this up in this amazing creative order. And then you start seeing level upon level of complexity and beauty added to that, which again is reflective of who God is. And we learn through the biblical narrative that even God is doing this in in a team setting as a trinity, right? We don't ever
Amen.
we don't find the word trinity, but we see the evidence in the description of it, even in the Colossians passage. There are these indications that God is doing this in community with himself as Father, Son, and Spirit to create this enormous, magnificent, uh, complex creation that he just wants to love and celebrate with, right?
Mark, that's brilliant, and this is where what my course really tries to help Christians think more Trinitarian in their thinking in their life. And you've named it exactly right. When we say that human beings were meant to bear the image of God, we need to remember that the biblical picture, the biblical depiction of God Himself, is a team. Like you said, I mean that God Himself, in a real way, is an organizational being, right? Because the Trinity itself is saying there's one identity, one being, God. So we're not talking about three different gods; it's one God, but comprised of three persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Three persons, one identity, common purpose, interdependent, right? That's the picture of the Trinity. What does that sound like in human terms? What would be a human image of multiple persons yet coming together in one identity with common purpose, working interdependently to bring new life and new reality into the world? That's an organization. So
Yeah.
that's why human organizations bear the image of God as organizations, because our very God is a triune God, which is an organizational, if you want to call it, has an organizational nature to it, which is exactly why all of life cannot be a solo sport. It is a team sport, and so the very work that you are doing in your company, even if you're like, but we just make widgets, or we just carry out insurance policies, or whatever, you're still doing all of that. Even if you're having a hard time saying, well, how does that function reflect God? Just the very fact that you're doing it together with other human beings means you are reflecting God. And so part of the purpose for Christians in their organizational life is to think, even just internally, in how I work with others to get work done, how can I conduct that in a way that really reflects the triune God, that reflects interdependence, that reflects common purpose, that reflects grace extended to one another, right? That the ways in which the Father, the Son, Spirit work together, we're meant to image, we're meant to reflect in how we work together with other human beings, including, again, in our organizational life. And that ought to, again, just open up all sorts of ways that can infuse purpose, the purpose that's always been there, but for us to recognize purpose in our organizational life.
And just listening to you describe this beautiful functionality of being able to create. Has given us that ability to create, but then not only what we're doing, but how we're doing it. And you start hearing, or at least I start hearing in your description, so many biblical calls to unity,
Mm-hmm.
to cooperation as well as collaboration, and that we would come together with recognizing each other's gifts, that none of us has all of the gifts, and therefore we can't operate independently. We have
That's
to
right.
be interdependent in the same way that God is. And then what are the gifts, the fruits of the Spirit, Galatians 5, that talk about how we would bring our best selves and our best behavior
Yeah.
to this collaboration for the building of unity, so that what we do, we enjoy doing together. I I had an elder at my church who said something to me about 10 years ago. We were struggling with unity within the church team that I was
Mm-hmm.
leading. And he made an observation that I've held on to. He said, when unity is struggling, or when unity is breaking down, the first thing that leaves the room is creativity, and nobody knows that creativity left.
That's right. That's
Um,
exactly right.
and that's just an expression of how this dynamic actually works inside of a team setting, be it in a church or a school or a business or government or any of those kinds of environments.
Yeah, and one of the sad things, Mark, is that in our public life, we've gotten so stuck and paralyzed in our differences that we don't recognize this Trinitarian truth that our differences are meant to be gifts to one another. That we need the different, we need the other, even when we don't fully share everything about, or don't fully grasp that the other is a gift to us because we reflect a triune God. And I think Christians ought to be sort of at the forefront of bridging differences and divides because we do follow and reflect a God who deeply values different, and his difference is not a threat. Difference is a gift to one another. And in so many spheres of our life, and sadly, especially politically, we need to recapture this Trinitarian truth.
Absolutely. Want to come back around that since we're soon to be in the midst of another election here
Yeah,
in a few days. Want to come back to that in a minute, but just want to kind of frame this again, that just the power and the beauty of what can happen in an organizational, or we can even say institutional
yeah,
setting of coming together. These actually, one of the people I was talking with Dr. Denison about, Michael Lindsay, talking about how institutions change the world because they're the platforms by which we can connect
yeah,
and bring our unique gifts to be combined with other people's gifts. And if something is going to last
yeah.
for a long period of time and make a real substantive contribution, it has to be connected to an organization or an institution where it can be nurtured and cared for by more than one person.
That's right.
Um, but I just, but at the same time, and when we were talking in some ways around racism in my church a few months ago, one of the things I wanted to point out is that uh, since we are broken individuals, we're going to build less than perfect organizations.
Of course.
And
Yeah,
we just need to recognize that there's no way for us on this side of heaven to build any organization that's going to be flawless. And so we need to recognize that and be ready to redeem and to revise our organization, um, but at a scale now, in our society. Where do you think it goes when a culture has such a low level of seemingly all of its institutions,
yeah,
and it doesn't seem to be? We're all struggling to wonder, can that ever change?
yeah.
So where do you think it goes if it continues on this track? And then what are some of your recommendations for how any individual or even a group of individuals can participate in rebuilding trust?
Yeah. Well, I am not a fortune teller, so I have no idea where this goes. Certainly, the current trend lines are not encouraging, but we as Christians are ultimately always called to hope. We're always called to believe that God's redemptive purposes can break in, even in the most dire circumstances. And so, I do think that's why Redeeming Babel exists, is to kind of create resources to help Christians imagine redemptive hope in the world in places that they might be tempted to give up on, and that one of those areas is in their organizations. And I think it starts one of I think places it starts again is by realizing that human organizations are just that, they're human. And we ought to treat them as human. We ought to treat them with the same values and spiritual convictions that we would treat an individual, right? So if we encounter an individual that has failed in a task, in a given task, in a given expectation, do we automatically write that individual off forever? Do we reject them? Do we demonize that individual? Do we call others to hate that individual? No, as Christians, we don't do that because we believe that individual is made in the image of God, which means that person is also a broken image of God because sin has corrupted that image bearing function. But Jesus died for that individual, and therefore there is ultimately redemptive hope. And so we want to extend grace, forgiveness, to work with that individual, to help that individual repair what is broken in his or her life, right? So again, we got this. I think most Christians got this at the individual level. They just throw it out the window when it comes to our institutions. So, I think we have to first start with, okay, when an institution lets us down, which it inevitably will, because it's human, right? Just in the same way that your mom or your dad or your brother or sister will let you down in some way, and perhaps already has, almost certainly already has, right?
Right.
Institutions are going to do that as well. And that same kind of process of, okay, let's evaluate what's gone wrong, but let's not write off that institution. Let's try to understand and diagnose what really went wrong. How can I help to be an image of redemption for that institution? How can I participate, contribute to that redemption? Which doesn't mean you just simply forget and forgive, or you forgive, but it doesn't mean you forget and just say, okay, well, right. If an individual stole money from you, you're not going to just like open up your bank account to that person. You're like, okay, we'll take baby steps of trying to rebuild trust. I think in the same way with institutions, like there are some institutions who have earned distrust. So I'm not saying all distrust of organizations is bad. There are really broken and flawed institutions. I'm just arguing that we don't write them off entirely. We approach them very much the same spirit we do with individual. Like where can I give them a second chance? Where can I give them some way to show that they are cooperating with God's redemptive purposes? How can I help them in that process? That same kind of wisdom that you have to bring to an individual's process of redemption, we have to bring to our institutions. But it does not mean we write them off. It does not mean we demonize them or we rally people to hate them, that institution either. So in some ways, it's not. The hope for us as a future is the same hope we have for another individual. We have to believe God is, through Jesus, is at work redeeming this world.
And one of the ironies, Curtis, that I've had in this experience, where you hear conversations, we've lived most of my life in ministry in a season of moving away from things like denominations. I've been a part of a denomination for my entire ministry, was educated within the context of a particular denomination, but we've really moved away from denominationalism in one way. And so there's this idea of, well, that's just a broken, flawed system. We need to do away with it. A similar thing when you hear in the more public setting about, well, we just need to defund the police in some conversations.
That's
And
right. Yeah.
what always interests me about that is okay, well, we could do that. We could just dismantle, police departments, or we could dismantle a school district, or we could dismantle a church denomination. But the very next day, we're going to start doing some of the things that
Completely.
will create it
That
all over
replicate those
again.
functions. Absolutely.
We're gonna replicate it because we need them. We
Yeah.
absolutely must have them. And so we're never going to wake up the next morning and say, okay, well, we're going to build the new institution. We're
Yeah.
going to do it better and we're going to call it
Yeah.
something, but we're going to start organizing
Yeah.
ourselves, because that's the only way that we can actually get things done that need to get done.
Yeah, that God has designed us to do, right? To reflect who He
Right.
is. You're absolutely right. And by the way, when we start rebuilding those institutions, we're liable to make the same mistakes that our forefathers and our mothers
Right.
did. It's human. We're human beings.
Right.
We're
And some of
broken.
those, yeah. And as I hear you talk, and this has always come across when I've heard you give conversations like this, is that some of those mistakes or some of those bad things that end up happening that break down trust, yes, some of them are probably going to emerge out of our selfishness
Yeah.
and are more on the intentional side. But then when we start working together, we're going to do some things that we're trying to do to make things better, and they're going to have unintended
Yes, that's
consequences
exactly right.
that are negative, that we were like, oh, if we knew it was going to do that, we wouldn't have
Yeah.
done it this way.
Yeah.
But
Mark, I'm a consultant, right? So one of the things that I've just come to realize is, when I consult with organizations and they're complaining about some system that's broken or that's not working, some policy or process or system, if you dig hard enough, almost always that thing that they really dislike was put in place to solve another problem. Right.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
it's just human nature. We are short of the new heavens and the new earth that only comes when Jesus comes. So until then, we're always, sort of half in the heading towards redemption, but still mired in sin. And so we should just expect we're going to have this life. And so when frustrating things come up that inevitably come up in any sphere of life, in family life, in individual life, in a marriage, but also in organizational life, we should just not be surprised. We should like, oh yeah, that's what it means to be a broken human being on the path towards redemption.
Yeah, I've been kind of encouraged in a strange kind of way. When I moved into the community that I'm in now, I wanted to be outside the walls of my church to a
Hmm.
certain extent, as you said earlier, and that can be hard for a pastor to do,
Yeah.
because you can be so busy with stuff that needs to be done inside the church. But I tried to get involved in my community, in the Chamber of Commerce and in the
Hmm.
city
That's
government.
awesome. That's great.
And what I found out was I would be sitting in a meeting for one of those organizations, and I would hear them start to talk about problems and things that they were trying to solve, and I would sit back and go, "This is just like church, or church is just
That's right.
like this."
Yeah, that's right.
That
That's right.
that we, to a certain extent, we all kind of feel at times like we're a bunch of Keystone cops that we just
Yeah.
keep running around making the same mistakes and wondering if we're ever getting better.
Yeah, yeah,
And
and that's the nature of life, you know.
no,
And so it's not something that we ought to just kind of throw our hands up in frustration and think, oh, this thing is ultimately broken. It's just more this thing is this thing. This thing is a human thing, and therefore, well, Mark. One thing I wanted to just also say is that one of the things that I found really helpful in helping Christians recognize their purpose, their God-given purpose in organizational life, is by helping them, giving them some categories. And my course does this. And again, if people are interested, they can go to redeemingbabel.org and actually take this course called God's Purpose for Your Organizational Life. But one of the things I do in this course is I give people just a fun quiz, and the quiz is ultimately meant to help them identify and give them very broad, these are meant to be very broad categories of how God assigns specific individual roles to people in organizations. And I use the categories, the classic biblical categories of prophet, priest, and king. So, prophet is somebody that's whose really job is to spot truth and name truth and tell truth. A priest is somebody that's trying to bridge what is broken, to heal what is broken, to heal broken relationships and restore. The priest was always the mediator in Israel, right? The king is the one that's trying to govern, trying to bring order, and seek justice, right? So again, these are broad categories, but they do
mhm,
represent in almost every organization. And this is where you're talking about how, wow, every organization, whether Christian or non-Christian, has sort of the same functions. Every organization needs these functions. They need somebody to help tell the truth, show and guide and explain to people the truth. They need somebody to help mediate and bridge, and create good ways of being together, good processes. That's the priest, right? And they need somebody to bring order and to actually move things forward or to defend. Those are the kingly functions. And
mhm,
I've really found it helpful when Christians realize, oh, in my insurance company, I actually play a priestly function. I'm actually the
mm,
one that everyone comes to when they have a problem, right? I'm the mediator within this
right,
organization. And that
right,
that can be when you recognize that oh, God created me, even me individually, to play a very specific role in this organization. And I really believe that's true by this Spirit that God has equipped us to have gifts to give not just to the church, certainly including the church, but also these other organizations that we're a part of.
yeah, just a great framework to understand how you bring that kind of giftedness and perspective in how it's necessary, how you need all three of those things,
Yeah.
um, for any organization to work well. Well, we have a few more minutes. I wanted to kind of take some of what we've talked about relative to institutions broadly and put it around the frame of the institution of government. There's an
Mm.
election coming.
Yeah.
Um, I've recently thought through this and thought, well, when we go to vote this time, we're probably going to have four or five things on our mind at least, and not trying to put these in any particular partisan category, but just anything and everything related to Donald Trump seems to be in every political American conversation right now.
Yeah.
Um, the issue of election integrity, of when we go into this process as an organized country, do we really have confidence in how the process is getting implemented? The economy obviously is very big on people's minds. We have the ongoing issue of abortion rights, and then foreign affairs seem to be bigger than they used to be because the pandemic has taught us that we're much more connected than we've ever been. And now things like in Afghanistan and in Ukraine are much more top of mind. We're having conversations about nuclear weapons at a scale we really thought we'd never have. Um, but when you start talking about the institution of government,
Yeah.
do you feel like that we have, for various reasons, turned this into something of an idol, a kind of a cultural idol,
Hmm.
and we no longer we've lost sight of the biblical both functions and boundaries of
Yeah.
government, and it's almost like it's become our favorite contact sport.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that kind of what we're doing in American society?
Yeah, I would frame it this way: is that we are turning images into idols, right? So, or an organization is meant to be an image. An image points to, reflects something of God, but is not God himself, right? There's a gap between the image and the imaged, and so organizations, including the organization of government, are meant to image, to reflect something of God, but there's a gap there. They're not God. They're not the ultimate source of power and meaning and purpose. And the heightened way in which we have invested politics with so much energy, with so much passion, with so much fear, right, is we are in danger, I think, of turning that from an image into an idol. We're making it more than it what should be. And once we think that it's going to solve all our problems or is the source of all of our problems, we're in danger of making it an idol, right? We're investing too much power and energy into it. So I do think we would do well to just like take a deep breath and examine ways in which am I investing uh, too much power to government in a way that it can't bear that kind of weight, and that when it happens, we're turning it into an idol. One other thing I will say, you listed all those different issues that you mentioned, and I want to zero in on the second one that you listed, which is election integrity. And the reason I want to do that is because I actually think that is actually a threat to a biblical understanding of organizations. And let me explain. So give me a moment here to
Okay.
unpack
All right.
this. Um, so when we treat another human being as an image-bearing being, that should be a guard from us from treating them simply instrumentally. And by that I mean we believe that if I'm as I'm relating to you, Mark, that you have inherent dignity, worth, and value because you are made in the image of God. You're an image-bearing being, right? You're just not a you're not solely a tool, an instrument. I should not just view you like, what can I get out of Mark? This conversation we're having, I should be relating to you as like you have inherent dignity and worth, and I should not just be calculating how do I get Mark to do what I want Mark to do for me, for my purposes, right? I should not treat you instrumentally. In the same way, we have to also approach our institutions, including our institutions of government and our institutions of elections, as having inherent dignity and worth just by themselves, because they are reflecting something of God's purposes for the world, and not solely view them, how do I use them? How do I capture them? How do I compel them to serve some function of my own, some that only benefits me or my side? And this is the problem with election denial, is that fundamentally it is motivated by a desire not to respect elections and government officials who oversee elections as having inherent dignity and worth and value, that they're meant to serve a function, which is to conduct free and fair elections, but instead are viewed solely through, are they generating the result that I want? Can I make them do what I want them to do? Because this is the reality, and I'm just gonna I've this is just a factual basis. that our elections have never been more fair and more free and more stable in reality than ever before. Our elections fit not perfectly. There's always going to be, sort of isolated cases of mishandling, fraud here or there, but it's a tiny fraction of all of what happens in elections. Now, for the most part, our election institutions are doing a very remarkable job of imaging God in terms of having fairness and justice. But there's a segment of our political life that has that has just treated them as like, no, are they giving me the result that I want or not? And if not, I'm going to actually tear them down. I'm going to cause distrust and even hatred towards those institutions, and that's a violation of the inherent dignity and worth and value of those institutions. Is to just simply treat them for like, are they on my side? Do they give me what I want or not? We wouldn't do that with another. We would. I hope we would know enough not to do that with another individual. We shouldn't do that with our institutions, and that's facing us in this election. 60% of Americans have a election denier on their ballot. Most of them are on the right, but there are some, like in cases of Georgia, Stacey Abrams has, in her own way, not as badly as I think the right has, but somebody on the left also has sort of cast, I think, unfairly doubt on the election process in Georgia. And this is a whole other conversation that I'm not going to go into all the details, but I want to say this is a problem on the right and the left, is in ways in which we're undermining our institutions of elections because we're treating them as instruments for our side and trying to make them do what we want them to do versus having an inherent dignity and worth as image-bearing institutions. So end of rant.
Okay. Oh no, good word. A good rant. Yeah, a good rant, because sometimes we just seem to, we forget, right? If we become the election denier, then we turn around and try to get elected. We've basically pulled the rug out from under our own feet, right?
Yeah.
And we forget about some other things, like the fact that we believe in a sovereign God. As Christians, we believe in a sovereign God who is watching over things. Now, I've talked with some younger people in recent days who have said, well, I just decide not to vote because God's going to take care of it anyway. I don't think that's a healthy way to participate. You're not participating in the collective work that God is a part of. Yeah. But we should rest that a sovereign God is watching over things. And then the other thing is, just practically speaking, history seems to reveal this. I'm a child of Watergate. And one of the things that Watergate illustrates is it's very hard to orchestrate a deception on a wide scale for a very long time.
Yeah.
I mean,
I was just at a conference at Johns Hopkins University, which actually brought together election officials from around the country, including from some of the most contested parts of the country, and I walked away so impressed with the durability, stability, and trustworthiness. Again, not perfectibility. That's never going to be perfect, but that overall, our election system is designed in a way that makes it incredibly difficult for anybody to pull off a sort of massive stunt the way that the election deniers are claimed happened in the last election.
Right. And and people need to learn that kind of reality, because we simplify things that simply are not simple.
Yeah.
And then that enables us to buy into things that are likely in many cases not true. Well, Curtis, thank you for your time today. I do want to give you 2 or 3 minutes here at the end. I know you've also recently been doing some really important work in the area of anxiety, and people can find out about that, as well as about your work with organizations and institutions at redeemingbabel.org. Tell us very quickly about your work. Give us the 3-minute elevator speech about your work in the area of anxiety, because that's connected to this in a big way. When you don't trust the major institutions, organizations of your society, that breeds fear in us. Well, who and what can I trust, right?
Well, and it goes in the other direction as well. When we actually have anxiety and fear in our life, that actually is not stemming from institutions, it's just stemming from life, and how life is inherently filled with anxiety. But we instead, rather than deal with them in the way that God intended us to deal with them, we sort of externalize that anxiety out onto institutions and think, oh, those institutions are responsible for the things, and that we displace kind of our anxiety outward onto other institutions, right? So it goes in both ways. And so, yeah, it's exactly because of this connection that I realized that, I can talk to the head rationally with two Christians about how they ought to think about things like institutions or politics or things like that. But so much of this ultimately stems from anxiety that we carry around in our life. And it's too long. I don't have enough time to explain why we have more anxiety in our life than we ever have before. But the reality is we do. And I believe that, again, that I think Christians have not been taught well on how to think and handle anxiety. That so much of the church, I would say, is stuck in one of two ways. We either treat anxiety as a spiritual flaw, like something to get rid of, almost perhaps in some circles even as a sin, as a sign that you don't have enough faith. And so we're supposed to pray anxiety away, so that anxiety is like stigmatized as a sin. That's one way. Or the other is that we strip anxiety of any spiritual significance and we just outsource it to secular mental health. And it's like, okay, anxiety solely is a medical condition to be treated with medication or therapy. Now, let me be clear. I'm a fan of both praying about your anxiety. I've taken anti-anxiety medication myself. I've been in therapy myself. But all of those approaches miss, I think, the fundamental biblical story about anxiety, which is that anxiety is not a problem to make go away, either by praying it away or by medicating it away or therapizing it away. Anxiety is fundamentally not a problem we make go away. Anxiety is fundamentally an opportunity. Anxiety is an opportunity. It's an opportunity, which means rather than making it go away, it's something we go through. It's hard. It's not easy. It's painful. But we go through anxiety because it is the actual pathway to spiritual growth, to becoming more like Jesus. And that's really what my course that you can find on redeemingbabel.org, it's called Anxiety as Opportunity for Spiritual Growth. And I've got a book coming out in May called The Anxiety Opportunity: How Worries Are the Doorway to Your Best Self. And so this is my way of trying to speak to the kind of emotional reality that is gripping so many of our people, especially our teens, our young people.
Yeah, lots of research coming out in that way as well. Look forward to the book, and hopefully that will help us to know how God can help us to be more trusting, more trusting of Him, more trusting of each other, and by extension, more trusting of our institutions and organizations wherever we're encountering them and being a part of them, right?
Amen.
Curtis, thank you so much for the conversation. I hope we can do it again soon. Really, really helpful stuff, and I know that our audience is going to appreciate listening to this conversation and connecting with you in other ways as well. Thank you for your time today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. This was such a fun conversation, Mark, and look forward to doing it again.
Thank you, Curtis, and thank you to all of you for listening. And if you like what you heard today, please rate, review us, and share this podcast with others so that they can be helped as well. Thank you for being a part of the Denison Forum podcast today.